Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to talk about the Sisters of Silence. Now, normally at this time I'd be doing the 2 Vrax videos this week. Those will be coming next week, but with everything going on with the Fem Stodies, or more correctly, the Tzeentch Stodies, I feel that the Sisters of Silence, long overlooked and now yet further pushed to the sidelines, are really deserving of a little bit of spotlight. And so that is what we're going to do today. The Sisters of Silence have a long, albeit broken, history, with the Order in essence having been disbanded twice, and with long periods of operating secretly and in the shadows. In fact, there is quite a lot to indicate that the very earliest incarnation of the Sisters of Silence was just such an organization of deliberate subterfuge, where the Sisters themselves functioned as high-ranking and extraordinarily specialized assassins, rather than the more specialized witch hunters that they became. Dark rumors even suggest that the true origins of the Sisters of Silence lay yet further back in the mists of time, with one of the ancient tyrants of old Earth long before the rise of the God Emperor and his campaign of unification, as there are whispers of the Hollow Ones, who once served the unspeakable king. And in an age of countless, brutal, murderous, tyrannical warlords all across Terra, one has to wonder just how bad this one had to be to gain such a title. With some even speculating that the title was gained not through his deeds, but rather due to him being a pariah, a psychic null, which of course the Sisters themselves are as well. This would certainly explain the sense of dread that the individual in question apparently inspired amongst his contemporaries, as all pariahs are viewed naturally, automatically, and unavoidably as abhorrent, as disgusting and disturbing by all normal living creatures. Unspeakable, indeed. Though I would also then hasten to add that this does seem to undermine the history somewhat, as how precisely did a pariah reach the level of even a local warlord? How was he able to get people to follow him, to obey him, to remain even theoretically loyal? Through sheer terror alone? Granted, much can be achieved with good old-fashioned fear, particularly in savage times such as pre-unification terror, but it does stretch credulity somewhat. Though a bodyguard of equally gifted individuals capable of further spreading that fear might lend a bit more realism to the claim. Whatever the truth may be, the God Emperor would of course certainly have been around during those times. And if he had heard about a special bodyguard of untouchable Hollow Ones, it might very well have piqued his attention. And the moment he figured out what a psychic null was, a pariah and its ability to affect the warp, he would unquestionably have become very, very fascinated indeed, as the God Emperor's ultimate aim, of course, was and has always been the defeat of chaos, the very force that he holds responsible for humanity's great fall during the golden age of technology. If indeed there exists individuals out there whom, through their very presence, can counteract the powers of the Psyker, the demon, and by extension their gods, then that would obviously be a weapon without equal against the forces of chaos. The will to use such a weapon as well speaks to the breadth of the Emperor's vision, and the depth of his commitment to humanity, as, bear you in mind here, a pariah is automatically viewed as revolting and disgusting by a normal human being. To a Psyker, being close to them is physically painful. To a psychic being, like say for example, an Eldar or a demon, they are anathema to their very existence. Thus, imagine how the Emperor must have felt about the Silent Sisters, the single most powerful Psyker the human race has ever produced. A psychic mind dwarfing that of most Elder Farseers. The mere thought of the existence of a pariah must inherently be the most vile, disgusting thing the Emperor could ever have thought of. And yet his hatred for chaos still trumped that automatic, instinctual hatred. Though, even then, it clearly took quite some time before he could bring himself to organizing them properly. Again, the precise when, where, and how of the creation of the Sisters of Silence as an official military organization is very difficult to determine. But in all due likelihood, the Sisters of Silence were probably organized either alongside the Divisio Investigatis at the onset of the Great Crusade, or sometime shortly thereafter. As nearing the end of the Imperial Crusade, the Sisters of Silence were well known, even if they existed in a sort of nebulous half-truth reality, where their presence was acknowledged, and they were not secret per se, and yet no one really quite spoke of them, or of the Divisio Investigatis, or the Black Ships. Now, in part, this mystery was necessary for simple reasons of security, as transporting something as highly precious as Psykers around the galaxy might have a lot of interested parties wanting to interrupt the transportation procedure. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, as the Divisio Investigatis is not necessarily the primary topic of conversation today. Briefly, however, the Divisio Investigatis is the larger organization formed either around the Sisters, or which integrated the Sisters as one of its most effective tools, as the job of the Divisio was to build the infrastructure required to handle Psykers. Because whilst the when, the where, and the how of the Sisters' creation may be a matter of mystery, the why could not be more obvious. As Psykers, untrained, unsanctioned, unaware Psykers, would quite probably be the single largest threat to the Imperium. The God Emperor, after all, was not in this merely just to unite the galaxy. He was in it to defeat chaos, the single greatest threat to all life, human and otherwise. And every single Psyker, whether they are aware of it or not, well, they're practically a portal to the warp just waiting to split open. And with potentially billions of these psychic gateways scattered across the galaxy, the Emperor knew that he needed a massive organization to police them, to neutralize them, and to train them where necessary. Because, of course, the great irony of the Imperium is that it loathes the mutant, and yet it is near completely reliant on the mutant, the Psyker, for communication and travel. Thus, Psykers are both the greatest threat to the galaxy and its single most valuable resource, both at once. But how to go about doing this then? The galaxy was of course an enormous place. There would be billions, if not trillions of Psykers out there, and there'd be more created every single day. How to discover them all? The Legionis Astartes, frankly, had better things to do. They needed to conquer the galaxy first, before they could start picking through the rubble for the occasional psychic survivor. What about the Imperial Army, then? The grandfather of the Imperial Guard. The Imperial Army was primarily an auxiliary formation, whose best and brightest regiments would be used alongside the adeptus Astartes as support forces, whereas the overwhelming majority would be used for garrisoning and policing purposes. They then had the manpower and the time to go searching. But searching for what, exactly? How does one tell a Psyker apart from a regular human being? Some of them are simple enough because, they shoot lightning out of their fingertips, but at that point you're probably a little bit too late already. How to discover a latent Psyker, then? Toss them in the river and see if they float? Rub garlic all over them and see if they react? Knowledge of Psykers is rare, and what knowledge does exist is largely useless when it comes to individual cases, because every Psyker is subtly different. One might fry your blood by turning it into liquid metal, whereas another might have barely enough power to lift himself into a hovering stance 5 centimeters off the floor. Whilst a third might see the future, but only 75% of the time. Entrusting the search for Psykers to laymen would not only not be very productive, but it would probably be actively detrimental and damaging, as whilst they probably wouldn't be able to find a whole lot of Psykers, I can guarantee you they'd find an awful lot of witches, and make an awful lot of bonfires. Don't get me wrong, zealotry is always appreciated, of course, but in these matters a bit of expertise was clearly required. And so the Divisio Investigatis was created. It was to contain people whose specialization it was to locate psychic individuals, and potentially subdue and transport them back to Terra. This organization was created very early on in the Crusade, as of course it would require an enormous logistical system to back it up, as this would need to cover every world in the Imperium, and so would be galaxy spanning. It would require hundreds, if not thousands of ships, and many times that number of supply stations, fuel dumps, areas where food, water, and all the various necessities of a spacecraft could be kept, as the black ships of course would not like to rely on the usual supply systems of the Imperial Navy, as, well, it's transporting unfathomably dangerous and potentially valuable cargo. You'd rather keep that stuff secret wherever possible, rather than just heaving to at random ports and requisitioning food. Not to mention, of course, the sheer number of agents that such an organization would require to cover the countless worlds in the Imperium, to continuously go through the trillions of people in search of Psykers. It would, by sheer necessity, be an enormous organization. Now, where exactly the Sisters of Silence fit into this is an interesting question. One of the more ludicrous rumors, in my opinion, is that the Sisters of Battle were not actually initially created within the Divisio Investigatis. Instead, they came from a unit known as the 1913 Indentured Irregular Infantry Regiment, which was supposedly involved in the pacification of the high world Pentakineis. The planet had been a valued and productive part of the Imperium for quite some time, when rumors began to emerge of a cult, slowly but surely growing in influence on the planet. Since this was well before the Inquisition, of course, the leading authority on cults like this were the Divisio Investigatis, as the cult known as the Final Banquet apparently possessed some sort of a sacred family, capable of carrying out grand magical rituals. which obviously, to the informed, sounded an awful lot like psychic powers. Moving as swiftly as possible for a behemoth construct such as the Imperium, the Divisio Investigatis dispatched a black ship to the world, but they arrived far too late. By the time when they actually managed to carry out a military intervention, their forces were destroyed the moment they touched down. Calling upon nearby Imperial army reserves, the Divisio Investigatis attempted to cordon off the major hive cities in an attempt to stop the spread of whatever was going on within it. But the psychic ritual that had already begun to expand slowly beyond the hive city's borders began to affect the Imperial army personnel as well, causing them to descend into a maddened state of crazed rage. In fact, the entire hive city was tearing itself apart as billions of people tore one another's throats out with their bare teeth and hands. This was, well, frankly, a bit above anyone's pay grade at that point in time, and whilst urgent requests were made for 6th Legion Astartes troops to be deployed, as they were operating relatively nearby, well, it was relative as in interplanetary terms, so by the time they would have arrived, it would have been far too late. The Divisio Investigatis ships in orbit attempted to stop the spread of the madness via orbital bombardment, but unsurprisingly, this really only made things worse. And as the Imperial auxiliary forces down on the planet were succumbing quicker and quicker, all hope appeared to be lost, except for the 913th Indentured Irregular Infantry Regiment, which appeared to be fighting on against citizens and allied Imperial Army forces without succumbing to the psychic assault battering down upon them. Not only that, they appeared to be offering remarkably effective resistance considering the limited number of their formation, a mere 800-odd to 1,000 troops in your average regiment. Seeing an opportunity to perhaps cut the cancer out at the heart and stop the unfolding catastrophe, the regiment was contacted by the orbiting ships and directed towards the source of the psychic disturbance. Whilst actively supported by the orbital weaponry of the ships above, the 913th Indentured Irregular Infantry Regiment managed to cut their way into the depths of the hive city, where they came upon the Sacred Family engaged in some sort of vile heretical blood ritual. The 913th required no further instructions as to what was expected of them, and after killing all of the members of this unholy family, the psychic ritual abated. This too seemed strange, as a ritual of such tremendous power and size and ambition, a ritual that for all intents and purposes had already been carried out, should not have been so easily snuffed out. Sure, the death of the caster of the ritual will always have a certain effect upon it, but by this point in time, surely the damage to the immaterial walls of reality would already have been done. And yet, after the 913th had passed through, it was as if nothing had ever happened. Sure, the planet was still in a state of absolute anarchy and disastrous chaos, as, people had been butchering each other in the streets 5 minutes earlier, and virtually all infrastructure, logistics, law enforcement, firefighting, etc. had collapsed, but at least people weren't going stark raving zomboid mad anymore, so there was that. The conclusion of the Divisio Investigati's officers in orbit was that the 913th somehow was a regiment composed of blanks, of psychic nulls, of pariahs. Thus, obviously, they swept them up in the holds of their black ships and departed, before any other Imperial forces could arrive and start asking pointed questions as to not only exactly how this could have been allowed to happen, but how on the God Emperor's good green earth it was stopped. The rest, then, is supposedly history, as the 913th formed the core of what would eventually become the Sisters of Silence. Personally, I do not give this story a whole lot of credibility because, well, first and foremost, 800 to 1,000 blanks in one regiment would have been noticed a long time before this. Now, there are mentions of the regiment apparently having a rather disreputable history, causing all sorts of fights and disturbances wherever it passed, but believe you me, 1,000 blanks is going to cause a hell of a lot more than a few barrack room quarrels. Nor would a planet capable of producing an enormously high percentage of psychic nulls be overlooked by the Imperium. Now, granted, no mention of 913, the supposed planet, was ever made again, and the number specifically has been wiped from Imperial records, which is a pinch suspicious, but I would think it might instead refer to, if anything, some sort of training camp or locationalized base. As again, there is no way this could have happened by accident. So if there is some truth to this story, then it seems more likely that the 913th Indentured Irregular Infantry Regiment was some form of controlled mass test deployment of the Sisters of Silence, to see how they might be able to operate on a larger scale alongside other Imperial Army forces. Again, I don't believe this to be the case, mind you, because there is no way the Emperor would not be directly involved in such an experiment, or at the very least Malkador, and there is equally no way that either one of them would not understand the military applications of such a formation. No, I think this is probably closer to a fanciful tale of the Sisters of Silence origins rather than a truly believable origin story. More likely, in my opinion, is that the Sisters of Silence did indeed operate under the auspices of the Emperor early on Terra, as the Emperor would have been knowledgeable of psychic blanks, and would undoubtedly have seen their value in his war against Chaos. Thus, it would only make sense to organize them into specially selected formations, perhaps not necessarily for the express purpose of hunting down Psykers at first, but such unfathomably rare and valuable individuals could obviously not be allowed to be left solely to their own devices. And so it makes a lot of sense to organize them into a specialized anti-Psyker organization, made up exclusively of one gender because, well, you do not want these bastards breeding, even if by some sort of freak accident, as the pariah gene is barely understood is a massive understatement. The pariah gene is in essence a complete mystery. In fact, the Imperium doesn't even know if there is such a thing as a pariah gene, if there is anything physical within the body of its hosts that causes this, or if it is indeed some sort of psychic phenomena. Not a mutation, but rather a scar in reality. Whether the anachronistic description of them lacking a soul might actually be far more of an accurate one than anyone wants to admit, and so on. And furthermore, any attempt to replicate the pariah gene, either via cloning or controlled mutation or some form of weaponization, has always ended in cataclysmic disaster. So, yeah. Casual breeding is probably a very, very bad idea. This still means, however, that the Divisio Investigatis would probably have had to operate for quite some period of its own history without the direct support of the Sisters of Silence as a proper-sized organization. Early on in the Divisio Investigatis' history, the Sisters were probably relegated primarily to the Black Ships, where their nullifying aura would be extremely useful for keeping the psychic prisoners under control, or dispatched in small, hyper-elite groups against uniquely dangerous targets. This due to the simple fact that psychic blanks are unfathomably rare. If a psyche is a 5-leaf clover, then a blank is a 7-leaf clover that's actually a dog that believes it's a 7-leaf clover. The fact that the Emperor apparently found enough female blanks on Terra alone, or Terra and Luna and Mars, I suppose, to outfit even a small elite detachment is remarkable in and of itself. And it would undoubtedly have taken a very long time and a lot of conquered planets for the Sisters of Silence to actually turn into a viable military organization. But eventually, with enough worlds brought into the Imperium's loving arms, they did become one. Being granted a special fortress on the surface of Luna, the Somnus Citadel, as their very own fiefdom, the Silent Sisters became quite the significant armed force, numbering well into the tens of thousands of individuals, which might sound like a lot, but bearing in mind, we are talking a galactic-sized armed force here, so in reality, those tens of thousands were probably scattered extraordinarily thin across the galaxy, manning the black ships and organized into smaller elite squads, yet again dispatched against particularly threatening targets. Though with these numbers, they would probably have been used a little bit more gregariously than they had been previously. Many, no doubt, lending their expertise in anti-Psyker matters directly to the Divisio Investigatis' agents, and then utilizing their more unnatural talents to aid with the capture of Psykers. But whereas this would remain, of course, their primary duty, more pivotally important would be the fact that now that the Sisters had a proper organization, they could be deployed en masse, especially alongside their brothers, in essence, in the adeptus custodes, giving the God Emperor not just an army of supremely highly genetically engineered demigod warriors, but sidekick psychic void little sisters as well, capable of turning a squad of custodes, already an enormous threat against any foe, into the ultimate anti-demon and anti-chaos force. This was undoubtedly not by sheer accident, as again the God Emperor's final goal had always been the defeat of the Chaos Gods, which he undoubtedly must have known would eventually come to some sort of final armed conflict, though the one the God Emperor probably envisioned, like a major invasion of the realms of chaos that he had once visited, for example, was not the conflict he would receive, as the Emperor, for all of his foresight and wisdom, failed to understand just how clever and manipulative the gods could be. He had too much faith in his sons, and so his great war was not one of human versus demon, but human versus human, whilst the monsters in the shadows sat by cackling and laughing. Though the Silent Sisters would get to match their blades against demonic hordes in more pitched battles as well, and against their favourite target, Psykers, as they certainly were not sat on the sideline during the events of the Horus Heresy. Indeed, they took part in some of its most pivotal and unfortunate battles, such as the Battle of Prospero, for example, where they deployed alongside the 6th Legion Astartes, the Space Wolves, and Legio Custodes elements to bring the Primarch Magnus the Red to heel. Now, the Emperor had dispatched orders that Magnus be captured and brought back to Terra aboard a black ship. This, in no doubt, so that, one, Magnus could explain his actions before the Emperor, as he had caused the Emperor a great deal of headache by his attempt to warn him of Horus's betrayal, and also so that Magnus might be able to take his place upon the Golden Throne and allow the Emperor to deal with that slight inconvenience in his laboratory. But due to the intervention of the War Master's own orders and the ignorance of the Sisters and the Custodes as to the true nature of Magnus's warning, Magnus was instead broken across the knee of Leman Russ and sent fleeing into the warp with the remnants of his legion, which had been defeated as much by the Sisters and the Custodes as it had been by the fury of the Wolves of Fenris. Returning back to Terra in large numbers, the Sisters of Silence were then engaged in the war in the Webway, alongside their Custodes brethren, as Magnus's misguided attempt to warn his father had broken open the wards that the Emperor had placed upon his sacred laboratory on Terra, where he was gaining access to the Eldar Webway, his great work that would have guaranteed humanity's ascension across the galaxy. But now, with all of its protective measures busted open, and with only the Emperor able to sit on the Golden Throne to keep it closed, it had become an enormous warp rift leading directly into the bottom levels of the Imperial Palace, through which the gods of chaos, of course, attempted to force every single demon, war machine, and traitor that they could command. Only the full-scale deployment of the Legiones Custodes and the Sisters of Silence was able to stem this apocalyptic assault. And I'd like to point out as well, the Horus Heresy, in all due likelihood, was a goddamn skirmish in comparison to the war within the Webway, where uncountable trillions of demons, lesser and greater, would throw themselves at the Emperor's defenders day and night for 5 years. If that doesn't speak to the effectiveness of the Silent Sisters, I don't know what does, as I doubt even the mighty Custodes could have stood their ground so effectively without their Null Sisters by their sides. But of course, it was not just the war in the Webway that was threatening the Emperor's domain. Outside as inside, the forces of chaos were making their play. And eventually, the forces of the War Master began attacking Terra itself, where, yet again, the Silent Sisters fought on the walls alongside the loyal Legiones Astartes, and contributed no less than they to Terra's eventual victory over the forces of chaos. But unfortunately for the Sisters of Silence, their lot would be one of lacking gratitude, as after the Horus Heresy, a lot was to change within the Imperium, one of which was the de facto dissolution of the Divisio Investigatis, and the transference of the Silent Sisters into the ranks of the adeptus astra telepathica, where they would become its military arm, and largely continue their duties, albeit under very different management. And as the Silent Sisters had once been used to being guided directly by the Emperor himself, it is not too difficult to see why this change in leadership was difficult for many of them to accept. And indeed, the Silent Sisters began to fracture, until the Silent Sisters as a large-scale organized military organization eventually ceased to exist, relatively shortly after the end of the Horus Heresy. Now, many would still continue on in their duties to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, but most would begin to vanish outwards into the galaxy, to carry out what they viewed as their sacred mission, to continue the duties bestowed upon them by the God Emperor, not by the newfound bureaucratic powers of Terra. Some of these sisters left on their own accord, as solitary individuals seeking to continue their quests. Some sought to abandon their duties entirely and begin to slip into the great masses of humanity. Others formed small groups, orders and sisterhoods, intent to continue their work as they viewed it best. And as far as the Imperium was concerned, well, the Silent Sisterhood had always been a secretive organization, and so when they began to slip away into deeper mystery still, most simply forgot about them, with the Sisters of Silence as an organization having fully disappeared into the mysteries of a long-lost time. One of GW's literary adventures best left forgotten, but nevertheless, during that highly nonsensical war, the Sisters re-emerged, a mere millennia or two later. Although they would then make a brief but eventful reappearance during the War of the Beast. One of GW's literary adventures that is best forgotten. Nevertheless, the Sisters did make an appearance after being called upon by the Lord Commander of the Imperium at the time, Corland, to join him in defeating the Orc threat. And then... No, let us not be led into the War of the Beast again, one of the singularly worst and tragically longest stories in Black Library history. Suffice to say, the Sisters of Silence appeared, did their thing, and then disappeared again, as if nothing had ever happened. And that is how the War of the Beast should best be remembered, as if something that never happened. But this does raise the question, what were the Sisters of Silence doing for the last 10,000 years? Well, some of them have of course remained in the service of Terra, operating alongside the Custodian Guard, operating alongside the adeptus astra telepathica aboard black ships, and as highly specialized witch hunters and killers of Psykers. Particularly valued are the services of the remaining Oblivion Knights, the highest ranking elite warriors of the Silent Sisterhood, those who not only possess unrivaled martial prowess, but who also demonstrate a capability of controlling their pariah gene like few others can, forming it, shaping it, and using it as a weapon rather than simply a sphere of anti-psychic energy. These very pinnacles of the Sisterhood are one of the Imperium's relatively few actually worthwhile responses to alpha-level Psykers. Psykers of such enormous ability that they are not a threat to a local community, or a village, or a town, or a city, or even a planet, but a solar system. Psychic minds so powerful they can enslave entire planetary populations as easy as they continue to breathe. Yeah, alpha-level Psykers are unfathomably dangerous, and short of tossing an entire chapter of Astartes at them, Oblivion Knights are just about the best and only solution the Imperium has. These sisters, however, whilst again nominally under the command of the adeptus astra telepathica, really don't take their instructions from bureaucrats at all, and remain in essence the Emperor and the Custodes' tool rather than those of the High Lords of Terra. As for all of the other sisters, those who left the main order to spread out across the galaxy, well, in part, they've been up to, breeding, which is actually rather impressive when you come to think about it. Remember, a psychic null is someone that a normal human being finds immediately repulsive, disturbing, awkward to be around at best, and someone they feel active resentment, antagonism, and violent thoughts about most of the time, irrespective even of physical beauty, with the example of Bekwa Kinska from the Eisenhorn books being a wonderful example of this. Kinska was described as remarkably beautiful, and yet, even as a prostitute, she could not make ends meet, because every time somebody laid so much as eyes upon her, they would inherently hate her. And if a Jessica Alba level beauty will be hated and beaten by anyone she meets, well, I imagine the tall, scarred, and muscled members of the Silent Sisterhood that scatter their way through the galaxy would have had a challenging time finding willing mates. Willing being the key word there. As I imagined, though there may very well have been the occasional exception, such as Gregor Eisenhorn and Bekwa Kinska, love would be difficult to find for these scattered sisters, and, in all due likelihood, the occasional struggle-snuggle was not entirely out of the question either. As apparently, these sisters began seeking out a way to reproduce the pariah gene. Now, there's some interesting questions to be had here, because, well, every previous experiment attempting to replicate the pariah gene in any way met with absolute disaster, to the point where the God Emperor himself banned all research into the matter unless it was under his direct auspices. This would sound as if it'd be damnably difficult for them then to manage to successfully reproduce the pariah gene by simply slamming their genitalia together with some random farmhand from a backwater world. So something a bit more specific must surely have happened. Now, there are rumors about some sisters growing capable, much like the Oblivion Knights, which kind of prove the theory, growing capable and able to suppress their auras, to turn them away from others, which might allow for reproduction without ropes or chains or similar bondage-esque devices. And if this was possible, perhaps there'd be some way to nullify the seemingly self-destructive tendencies of the pariah gene long enough to bear a child, who would then still nevertheless be imbued with the biological capabilities of the mother. If this was true, then it is still kept a very, very closely guarded secret amongst the Sisterhood. Probably for good reasons, as over the last 10,000 years they haven't seen any reason to rejoin the Imperium, suggesting that they are not feeling all too trusty of the current Terran bureaucracy, presuming probably that if they were to reveal their secrets to the High Lords, they wouldn't remain secret for long. And hey, if there's anyone out there who can keep a secret as huge as this, the potential stable manufacturing of psychic blanks, it would be the Silent Sisterhood, as their very existence from their inception has been secretive, to again the point where this elite band of warrior women essentially disappeared from Imperial records for 10,000 years. And again, it is worked into the very basis of their organizational structure, via the Vow of Tranquility. This is a binding oath that every sister makes upon their elevation into the Sisterhood, forbidding them from ever speaking a verbal word ever again, instead adopting the sign languages of their order, both Thoughtmark and Battlemark and Erskirder, which is a verbal, sort of in a way, variant on the previous languages, where the sisters use machine code, clicking noises, etc., to transmit messages over long distances where, they can't actually sign language to one another. And obviously, these sign languages are extraordinarily secretive in their own rights, where they cannot be taught to anyone outside of the Sisterhood. This, as you can probably also tell, will make communication in and of itself difficult, even more so the spilling of secrets, to the point where the only way the Silent Sisterhood can really communicate with outsiders is via interpreters, which will usually be sisters in training who are still allowed to speak. In fact, their ability to speak is viewed as shameful, and it is a tremendous honor when they are elevated fully into the ranks of the Sisterhood and allowed to speak no more by taking the Vow of Tranquility, which is further symbolized by the granting of a helmet with a portcullis-style armored gorget, which always covers the mouth. Thus, the Silent Sisterhood, even in the modern-day 41st millennium, is an incredibly insular organization, with virtually no connection to the outside world beyond that of the Emperor, his custodian guard, the adeptus astra telepathica, although even then only insofar as to carry out their own chosen duties. Make no mistake, they are not truly under the command of the adeptus astra telepathica. They merely choose to operate under their umbrella as it suits their purpose. And very rarely, the Silent Sisterhood will cooperate with the Inquisition, although even then, very hesitantly, and more of an individual basis between Inquisitors. Usually when the Inquisitor in question has given some serious service to the Silent Sisters, as they do gain psychic nulls from other sources than their rumored breeding techniques. And in fact, if aforementioned breeding technique does not exist, they are wholly reliant on either finding psychic nulls themselves or receiving them as gifts from other organizations. And few are as vast and as powerful as the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition, of course. This also means that the Silent Sisterhoods views themselves as a force separate to the rest of the Imperium, who only really obey the authority of the Golden Throne and none other. Even the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition cannot truly command the Silent Sisters, not even to the degree that they can command Space Marine chapters, largely due to the fact that the majority of Inquisitors don't even know they exist, of course. And this degree of separation, and their overriding holy purpose, also means that the sisters tend to be rather callous about the lives of other Imperial servants, to the point where even the Inquisitors might think that they're getting a little bit cold. And considering it's the Inquisition's job to nuke entire planets when called upon, that's saying something. Though I hasten to add that this is not because they hate humanity or anything like that, although they probably have every reason to, as each and every one of them probably has countless stories of being unfairly treated by the vast majority of humanity, 99.9% in their past, but simply because of their overriding duty. Their duty is to the God Emperor and the protection of humanity as a species, not individual humans. And thus, whilst they will, of course, avoid any unfortunate extra casualties wherever possible, they will also not hesitate for even a single solitary second, should a little bit of unfortunate collateral be the required cost for the capture, subjugation, or death of an enemy Psyker. But, of course, such isolation also brings with it weaknesses. There is only ever so much that scattered bands of individuals can do. particularly on a galactic scene. And so the Sisters of Silence's contribution to the Imperium at large was probably relatively negligible for the last 10,000 years, as the Sisters focused on building their strength and continuing, wherever possible, their duties. But with the return of Robert Guilliman, this changed. Here was not a Terran bureaucrat, but a son of the Emperor. One who was promising to begin the rebuilding of his Imperium. One who was already fighting alongside his custodian guard. And one, of course, that the Silent Sisters had more or less saved during his battle with Magnus on Luna. Incidentally, I suspect Guilliman might have brought something weird with him after that confrontation, but maybe we'll do a little bit of a joke on that later. Regardless, after Guilliman had talked to his father, he re-emerged from the deepest chambers of the Imperial Palace with a plan to begin the Indomitus Crusade. And the Silent Sisters pledged their full-fledged support to this great cause, coming out in numbers that none had ever expected. Tens upon tens of thousands of Silent Sisters, gathered in vigils and cadres all across the galaxy. These would eventually then become their official organizations, with a vigil representing an established organization or order with a base of operation, their own armories and their own supply lines. Much like an Astartes chapter, in essence, these would usually number up to 1,000 sisters. These vigils would be declared and spread out throughout the Sisters of Silence's own network, essentially establishing them in preparation for the eventual arrival of the Indomitus Crusade, and their then ability to rejoin the Imperium at large as a properly organized military arm. Whereas the cadres would become the smaller organization within the vigils, their effective military units, which would be able to operate in battlefield conditions alongside their newfound allies. No longer would the Sisters of Silence be policemen in the shadows, or vigilant assassins. They would be an army once more. Now, I do have some logistical questions as to how exactly this happened. Mind you, as bear you in mind here, the Sisters of Silence... I wonder how many times I've said Sisters of Battle throughout this video, as I felt myself being tempted right there. As the Sisters of Silence are, of course, possessed of a remarkable array of highly complex and specialized war gear. Even their basic form of protection, the Vratine armor, is a combination of power armor and void mail protection. This is not the kind of stuff you're going to be able to produce on any backwater world. And after 10,000 years, even if they had kept as good a care of the armor they already had as possible, damage, wear and tear, and the need for replacement part would almost certainly have seen every single suit ruined, without some sort of access to a larger centralized storage and production operation. And for this to remain large enough to support the tens of thousands of sisters apparently being scattered throughout the galaxy, oof, boy, the logistical supply lines alone would be one hell of a complicated mess. But clearly, the Sisters of Silence are expert in subterfuge and have managed to keep this as secret as they could. And hey, in a post-Call world where apparently millions of space marines, nay, super space marines, were gathered in enormous cryostasis vaults all across the Imperium, who am I to question a few thousand suits of armor or bolters gone astray? It does sound an awful lot like small potatoes when you put it like that, doesn't it? The rest of the Sisters' war gear is usually focused around the annihilation of Psykers or other high-value targets of a psychic nature, as the Sisters' first and foremost weapon is of course their null aura, their ability as blanks. Now, this ability only has a relatively small area of effect around the Sisters, a few meters at most perhaps. Oblivion Knights can extend this area in a given direction significantly more, but for most Sisters to be truly effective, they need to get up close. Thus, the Vratine armor is important to allow them to get that close without dying from bullets or shrapnel or grand pianos hurled at them through psychic force. When they get there, killing a Psyker is not at all easy either. Many Psykers can wreathe themselves in nigh impenetrable fields of psychic energy, or make their flesh hard as steel, etc. But more often than not, they all have certain things in common, like the need to breathe, for example, and thus a good old-fashioned flamer, burning the very air from their lungs, is a valued and oft-used weapon. Or, alternatively, they have nervous systems. Perhaps you cannot pierce their skin, but if you can send 1,000,000 volts worth of pain-laced electricity through their bodies, you might not need to. The Sisters also use somewhat more traditional weapons, like the Vratine Bolter, which is in essence just an Astartes bolter but adapted for the use by mere mortals, and also power swords and general issue power weapons, along with specialized equipment like the Psych-Out grenade, which can be used both being hurled by hand and fired by Vratine grenade launchers. Now, the Psych-Out grenade is ridiculously rare, usually only used by Grey Knights or high-ranking Inquisitors. So the fact that the Sisters of Silence have managed to maintain the production of these grenades, or their continued supply, is also rather impressive. But all of this fancy war gear would of course matter not one iota if it is not wielded by expert hands. And the Sisters of Silence have kept up their training regimes just as well as their logistical routes, with the Vigils, or their predecessors, local sisterhoods and organizations, having kept up their training regimes, creating undoubtedly their own temples, their own little barrackses and hidden areas on planets where they could continue to raise the next generation of Silent Sisters. Now, individual skill at arms is of course a valuable attribute to any warrior, but even more importantly now during the Indomitus Crusade is the ability to operate as part of larger military units. In this field, the Sisters are still remaining a bit anachronistic. They refuse to be placed under the command of any but their own numbers, and will only operate alongside Imperial forces, not as a part of them. At the very least, not unless it's led by Guilliman himself, or the custodes, or one of their most trusted lieutenants. And even then, they will only operate in cooperation rather than under them. This is undoubtedly a bit of a weakness, as even Space Marine chapters value the cooperation of Imperial Guard forces or allied Space Marines. Isolating themselves completely from these elements will no doubtly see the Sisters heavily outnumbered in many cases. This, combined with their need to seek close-quarters combat, well, the life expectancy of a Sister, I imagine, is not particularly long. On the other hand, though, you could easily make the argument that perhaps staying away from allied forces is a prudent course of action, considering their very nature repulses and angers those they are supposed to be fighting alongside. Maybe dividing the battlefield is not such a terrible idea then after all. Though I'm sure even the stoic sisters would on occasion enjoy a little bit of artillery support now and then, maybe some armor, as whilst the sisters do have access to a fair bit of specialized weaponry in regards to this as well, such as rocket launchers, for example, they don't have a whole lot of heavy support. Though, as the Indomitor's crusade continues to grind on, one would expect it to be inevitable for them to be formed into proper militarized forces in their own right, with their own armor, their own logistics, their own support elements, thus allowing them to remain effective while still yet also separate. And hey, not like there's any danger of them going rogue or anything, so why not? Though, well, having said that, this would of course be the natural evolution of the Silent Sisters to give them an army of their own, but seeing as they were again so recently overshadowed by female custodes, maybe they'll have to remain comfortable on the sideline for quite some time longer. We can only wait and see. But until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.